Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are pleased to be in Missoula and to see all of our friends that have braved this bad weather to give us a record crowd at our Outlook seminars. Good morning. I would like to welcome you to the 39th Annual Economic Outlook Seminar presented by Northwestern Energy and the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. My name is Chuck Keegan. I'm the retired Forest Industry and Manufacturing Director in the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. We're pleased to be able to begin our program this morning with the official welcome from the University of Montana. And to do that, we have with us the President of the University of Montana. Would you please welcome Royce Engstrom?
Thank you, Chuck. Good morning. Looks like an intrepid crowd that came out this morning in the snow. And we are looking forward to a record crowd here today, and I'm sure they'll be drifting in over the next few minutes. Well, thank you for attending this economic summit, and I want to give a special thanks also to Northwestern Energy for sponsoring the event and for hosting the reception last night. It was a pleasure seeing Bob Rowe and his colleagues, and look forward to interacting with them during the course of the day. You know, there are few things more interesting and more important to us than our economy these days. Just the other day, the Missoula Chamber of Commerce held an event at the Doubletree, and it was a huge crowd as well. The interest is intense, and again, hardly anything could be more important to us as a discussion in these days. This is the 39th year of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research giving these Outlook seminars, and that's a tremendous accomplishment to have this go on that long year after year and draw the record crowds continuing that it does. They draw upon expertise, of course, from the Bureau itself, and I'm happy to say that that expertise continues to grow year after year. We just added, under Pat's direction, a new energy sector to the Bureau a couple of years ago in recognition of the increasing importance of that industry to the state of Montana. But of course, they also draw upon expertise from across the state, and as you listen to the people present today, you'll hear perspectives from around the state. The Bureau is, in this Economic Outlook seminar, traveling to, I think, 9 cities, 9 towns this year, and there'll be great turnouts and intense interest in every one of them. You know, between this seminar and the mid-year updates that the Bureau conducts, the Economic Quarterly magazine that they put out, they do a terrific service to the state of Montana and to our local communities and to the university in helping us all understand the economy and try to help us understand where that's going. So I do want to give a special thanks to Pat and your leadership, Pat. It's been a dynamic organization all along, but it certainly has been in the years of your leadership, and so I appreciate that. I appreciate the support of Dean Larry Gallanchetta, who oversees the School of Business Administration in which the Bureau resides. I'm especially looking forward today to hearing the keynote speaker, Greg Gianforte. Greg has been very active lately in helping to push the IT sector in education and in the economy, and so I'm especially looking forward, Greg, to your comments later today. Thanks for being here. You know, the university is proud not just to have folks that analyze and forecast the economy, but folks that help drive the economy through either workforce development, through the 2-year programs, the 4-year degree programs, the graduate education, the professional programs. All of those programs produce the workforce for the state of Montana, for the region, and for the nation. I'm very proud of that. But in addition, I'm very excited increasingly about the movement of ideas from the university into the private sector, whether that's through Montech, the Incubator Center on East Broadway, or soon to be the Missoula College on East Broadway, next door to Montech. The movement of ideas from the laboratory into private businesses on an increasing frequency. Those are very exciting developments, and the university is proud to help move the economy of the state of Montana and the region and the nation, in addition to understanding the economy as we're going to do today. The area of cyber infrastructure, for example, is something under intense development at the university, but very much in cooperation with private sector folks here in Missoula. You may have noted a few weeks ago, Missoula was recognized as the 5th largest city in terms of IT startups in the category of cities 250,000 and smaller. That's a significant recognition and really speaks to the ingenuity of both the private sector and the folks in public higher education. So I'm proud to be a part of today. Look forward to learning, like all the rest of you, what the state of our economy is. So Pat, thank you for bringing your expertise here, and I hope you all enjoy the day as much as I'm going to. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Royce, for the good words and setting the stage for the program today. We're certainly proud on behalf of the University of Montana to be able to bring you these Outlook seminars. By way of a bit more introduction this morning, let me give you some background on our Bureau for those of you who may not be familiar with us. The Bureau of Business and Economic Research is the research arm of the University of Montana School of Business Administration. The Bureau was begun in 1948 and since then has been involved in a wide variety of activities, including economic analysis and forecasting, industry-level research, survey research, and of course what we're about today, information dissemination. We also publish the Montana Business Quarterly, to which many of you now subscribe, and I'll point out some additional information on our Bureau on the inside of your program folder, and we would invite you to contact us if we can be of any assistance to you or your organization. Well, as you see, and Royce mentioned our major sponsor, but we have a number of sponsors for the Outlook seminars, and I would like to take a moment now and thank them and recognize them individually. Our principal Outlook sponsor is Northwestern Energy. We have 3 statewide Outlook sponsors: Pacific Steel and Recycling, Benefis Health Systems, and the Montana Chamber of Commerce. Our local Outlook sponsors include First Interstate Bank of Missoula and the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce. And in Missoula, we have 2 local broadcast sponsors that we'd like to recognize. The event's going to be videotaped by the Missoula Community Access Television Group, MCAT, as part of their Media Grants Assistance Program to nonprofit organizations. And the event is also being broadcast by the University of Montana School of Business Administration. So I would like to ask you all to join me in a round of applause recognizing these sponsors that really make it possible for us to bring the Outlook seminars around the state. Well, our theme this year is making Montana the first best place and how entrepreneurship can create high-paying jobs in the state. Developing high-paying jobs has been the goal of almost every economic activity and economic development effort in Montana in my memory, and that's why we're delighted to have as our keynote luncheon speaker a person who has created literally hundreds of high-paying jobs in Montana-based companies. So make sure you're with us at lunch. You'll get a lot out of that presentation. And as always, in the core of our program, we're going to look in depth at the Montana economy, regional and local economies within Montana, and major industry sectors in the Montana economy. And in looking at the economy and its components, our speakers will do that with an eye toward growing the Montana economy and increasing the earnings of Montana workers. As usual, we've allowed time for questions after each of our presentations, and we would ask you to please hold your questions and comments until that time. And to make it easier to follow the presentations, especially in a big room like this with a large crowd, you have the speakers' PowerPoint presentations in a booklet and I'll say that they will also be available for download on our website in the next couple of weeks. So we begin our formal program with a look first at why we feel our theme is an important one to Montana, and some thoughts on what kinds of jobs might spur increased worker earnings. And then we're going to move into global, national, and statewide economic conditions and forecasts. And to do that, I would like to introduce the director of our Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Would you please welcome Pat Barkey.
Thank you, Chuck, and good morning, everyone. This is really an exciting time to be talking about job growth because the economy is finally turning around. But as we see and we look at this target of job growth, the first thing we notice and the first thing that comes to our attention is that not all jobs pay the same. So there's really quite a dispersion. On the higher end of the scale, we have a lot of white-collar jobs, natural resource jobs, certainly mid-range construction, and you can see the lower range. So when we're talking about high-paying jobs, and of course these are statistics which are true on average, when we're talking about high-paying jobs, we have to have our eye on the target. Not all jobs pay the same, and certainly we should recognize that in our efforts if that's truly our goal, is growing high-paying jobs. Interestingly enough, as our keynote will highlight, is the fact that Montana has not done that good of a job, quite frankly, in terms of attracting high-paying jobs. On average, as Greg Gianforti will share with us, we have a ways to go, quite honestly, in terms of climbing up the rankings to become a better-paying state. So what I thought I would do is kind of give you some insight as to why that might be. First, I want to start with just pulling a few of the jobs out from that very long graph I just showed, just some of the high-paying industries, and look at where the jobs are in the economy. So when you look at the Montana economy and you look at the fraction of employment in just these 5 industries I've shown, there are the shares. So for example, manufacturing, a little over almost 4% of employment in manufacturing, which is one of the higher paying industries. How does that compare to the US? Well, here's the issue, okay, at least part of the issue. And that is, with the exception of mining, which includes oil production, Montana tends to be a little light in terms of the proportion of the workforce that work in some of these higher paying industries. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for us to be a high wage state. We're a little bit light in some of the higher paying industries. They don't necessarily all fit here, but that's where we are. On the other side of the equation, well, again, when you pull out a few industries, in this case I have 5 industries which are on the lower paying end of the spectrum, and you look at the proportion of the workforce in the state of Montana in these, you can see those from the blue bars. And again, with one exception, which is administrative services, we tend to be overly represented in some of the lower paying industries. So this is a challenge. It's what we are today, and growing high paying jobs will be a little bit of a deviation from this trend, if you will, because going the way we are has led to these results. We're also going to hear the story from someone who has a lot more credibility than as a researcher who simply studies high growth firms and high paying jobs, to someone who's actually done it. Why is that important for our program? Well, these high growth firms, which of course right now technology certainly is one of those, are really a pretty small piece of the economy. When you look at all the firms in the economy, only 2% by one definition are classified as high growth. A very small sliver. Most firms are not high growth firms. But when you look at the contribution of the high growth firms to overall job growth, you can see how outsized their importance is. So this 2% of firms in the economy contributed about 35% to overall job growth. So it's important for us to hear the story of companies like Right Now Technology. It's important because Right Now Technology is also a high-paying job. So as an example, as something that maybe could be emulated, as our speaker will say, it's certainly worthy of the program. We're happy to bring that to you. So let me now turn and look at my traditional topic, which is to look at the outlook for the national and for the Montana economy. And the short summary of my outlook is that I no longer spoil the party by talking about the economy. Things are actually getting better. You can invite me. Please invite me. When you look at the U.S. economy, things really do seem to be picking up. We just got, after I made this slide, some news on the fourth quarter economy that showed that the second half of 2013, one of the better 6-month periods that the U.S. economy has had since the recession was over. So there's signs all over that the economy is getting better. It's been disappointing job growth, but it's been very consistent and it's accumulated to some impressive numbers. I think one of the more encouraging things and one of the newer developments is the fact that business confidence is starting to come back, particularly small business. So businesses are starting to digest everything that's been thrown at them, and they're thinking about growth again, even though we went through a government shutdown, which by and large was a non-event in the national economy and even in the Montana economy overall. Certainly not the economy of West Yellowstone. As we look globally, our trading partners are all getting better. Some of them could be healthier, but they all seem to be doing better. We're not using the word crisis in Europe as much, and Asia's getting better. And of course, we had this energy development, which has been this new spark. It's showing up in the national economic statistics. Of course, as any economist with two hands, on the other hand, there are some things that cause some concern. The labor market in this economy is still anemic, sick, I don't know what word you want to use. There's some issues. We've had some major pieces of legislation come down to us from the federal level. And whether or not you agree with these, whether these were good moves, Dodd-Frank, even Sarbanes-Oxley, you can put the Affordable Care Act in that category, all attacking real problems in a way that was perhaps justified. None of them are pro-growth pieces of legislation. All of them are extra baggage for us to carry around as we try to grow. And finally, we just have to admit that we've been fooled before. I mean, we've had false dawns in the economy before. It's been a very, very sluggish recovery. In fact, to make this point, you can look at do something which economists are really not supposed to do, and that's look at old forecasts, because they're rather humbling, all right? So if you go all the way back to 2010, and you say, in 2010, what were people saying the economy would do today, 2013, 2014, so forth? And that's what these growth bars represent. And they're all mostly over 3%, which is pretty good growth for the national economy. So in other words, back in 2010, people said, 2013, that'll be good, all right? And then 2011 came around and they said, well, you know, we got some new data, we're not taking off quite as fast. They cut that back. 2014 will be the good year. And you can see where this is going. 2012, again, another downward revision to expectations. Good growth is now waiting for 2015. And now we get to the end of 2013, and we think we know where that number is going to come in at. And there you go. We're not going to really break out until, what, 2015, 2016. So this is the question. Next year. It's always next year. And next year always is ahead. Why is that? Well, to get some understanding, we need to understand that there's been some rather profound changes happening in the U.S. labor force. And to show that, I put up a graph which roughly coincides with my life. I just noticed that. I guess I'm on the way down now, aren't I? You look at, in this case, what this is the labor force participation rate. This is the fraction of Americans aged 16 and over who either have a job or are looking for work. And if you go back to the 50s, the baby boomers were just being born. When the baby boomers started coming into the labor force, that rate went up and up and up. Of course, what really happened, of course, is the increasing participation of women in the workforce. And there you can see what a gigantic phenomenon that was. You can see how that fraction overall pushed up to about 67%, stayed there for a decade and a half, and when we began the recession, it was still at 66%, fairly stable. But of course, you can see what's happened since. Since the recession and the recovery, and into the recovery, we've consistently seen a decline in the number and the proportion of Americans who are working. And this number has even come down a little bit further from this. And to get some idea as to why that is, the real answer is it's a mystery. Some people think it's demographics. Some people think, well, of course it's going to go down. Those same baby boomers are now retiring. As they retire, you leave the workforce. Except for Chuck Keegan, we bring him back. So we have the question is, if you look at labor force participation by age, it doesn't really support that contention. So let's just look at 2 years. 07 was when the participation rate was still up there. And this is the labor force participation for three age groups, and not surprisingly, it's those of prime working age that have the highest participation rates. When you get to 55 and up, that's a smaller proportion. So now we go forward to 2013, what happened? It's the older people that were even working more. Perhaps it's because their nest egg was wiped out by the financial crisis and the stock market going down. They're actually working more. It's younger people who are putting off entering the labor force, and even those of prime age. Those aren't big percentage point differences, but multiplied times the hundreds of millions in the U.S. labor force, it's a big number of people who are out of the economy not working. So really, to look a little bit more closely at the labor force, put together this little graph to try to show you, again, the condition of the labor market. Prior to this recovery, we summarized the condition of the labor market very simply. What's the unemployment rate? And we knew 10 was high and we knew 3 was low. It's gotten a lot more complex. We're looking at a number of measures of how the labor force is done. There's a bunch of measures here, and I've spread these out into 4 categories. There are categories that mention employer behavior. What are employers actually doing? How many people are they hiring? Then there's confidence indices in the lower right-hand corner. Confidence can be literally that, a confidence index, or it can be something like a voluntary quit. If someone voluntarily quits their job, it means they have some confidence they're going to get another one. All right? Utilization is the lower left-hand corner. Utilization involves things like how many people in the U.S. labor force are working part-time because they can't find a full-time job. They're not included as unemployed, but they're certainly not fully employed. So it's a different dimension. Finally, we have some leading indicators that give us an idea of where things are going. So in order to track all these measures at once, this graph is a little device. It's a device that starts with a reference point, and that reference point is that before the recession began. So the fourth quarter of 07. All these measures were looking pretty good, and this is broadly speaking as a reference point where they were. They all got worse when the recession hit. So the next reference point is the trough of the recession, the absolute low point before the economy started to turn around. So how have they performed as we march through this recovery? Well, we go 1 year into it, and now you can see what this graph does. It measures the progress of all these indicators at the same time towards the goal of getting back to where we were before the recession hit. And as we go into the first quarter of 2011, these forward-looking indicators are getting better, so we're seeing unemployment claims go down. Some of these utilization measures are actually getting worse. So the proportion of marginally attached workers, those who are working less than 8 hours a week, that actually got worse as we got into the recovery. Another year forward, you can see the same unbalanced pattern. Some of these measures getting closer to where we were before the recession began. I'll click it one more time, my last data point, a lot of data here, so it just stops in the first quarter of 2013. Some of the measures are better, all right, but a lot of them are still in the tank, particularly utilization. You can see that fraction of people working part-time for economic reasons. That's really hasn't gotten back to where it was before. So this is a big issue. What else is going on in the U.S. economy that's important for Montana? Well, a lot of news has been out there about what's going on with energy. And the increased production, in this case on this graph, of petroleum is a major, major event in the national economy as it is here regionally in Montana and North Dakota. You can see on this graph, it interrupted that slow decline of domestic petroleum production and really gave a big boost. The projection is that that decline will eventually set in again as new production stops coming online. Whether that's the right forecast or not, it's going to happen sometime. How does that compare to consumption? This is its own unique story. Consumption has actually plateaued as well. Not as well, but consumption has plateaued after growing for all my lifetime. It's actually plateaued and started to look like it's begun a slow decline. It's because of efficiency, because of the way Americans are using energy, in this case petroleum, but that still leaves a pretty substantial difference. So the point I want to make in this graph is that this difference between domestic consumption and domestic supply is what we import, okay? Hopefully from places like Canada, but probably also from places like Venezuela and Nigeria, all right? So even though this difference between production and consumption is expected to shrink substantially, which is a major event in the economy, for the foreseeable future, we're going to continue to import petroleum. And it's important to recognize and know about that. What else is going on? Well, one of the things we keep track of in the global economy is what's going on in commodity markets. We do this because it's been the strength of commodity prices which have helped keep many, many Montana producers very happy over the last several years. What's going on with those prices? Well, on the metals side, we're seeing what I guess I would call a slow retreat, a fairly gradual but very noticeable market decline. Here's a little graph of copper prices. This goes back from 07 to 2013, so you can see it's not a precipitous drop, but a decline. It's showing up in the economy. There's lead and there's zinc. So this is important for Montana producers. It's also an indicator of what's going on in other commodities like palladium and gold that are noisier and harder to show on this graph. Interestingly enough, the event that's really driving this is growth in the Chinese economy, more than anything else. Growth in the Chinese economy, kind of a bewildering number. It's enormously high by our measures, but it has a pattern. So you can see it when the Great Recession hit, the Chinese economic growth went from double-digit rates down to all the way down to 9.2, okay? And the recovery, it grew, but you can see that the recent event that's really important for Montanans, if you have any stake at all in what's going on in natural resources, is that this growth rate has tapered off. So around 7.5%, and as that has cooled off, relatively speaking, of course, as that's cooled off, that's eased up on the demand side and caused commodity prices to start to wobble a bit, and this is important. In terms of what's going on in the ag markets, this is always entertaining to watch me talk about agriculture, but I am smart enough to know what's going on with prices. Might not know which way of a tractor is forward, but if you see what's going on with prices, they've been in slow retreat as well. There's beef prices is the first one, which really hasn't shown much decline at all, and we're really happy to have George Haynes on this program to talk about whether that's going to continue. On the grain side, both wheat and barley have weakened a little bit recently, and that has some impact for Montana ag producers. So to summarize on the U.S. side, what's going on? Well, there's a whole lot going on in the U.S. economy. You do have a digest of a U.S. forecast in your briefing book. We're going to mostly emphasize the Montana economy in this program, but let's just summarize. Despite the fact that we had a really good second half of 2013, 2013 is still going to come in as slightly worse than 2012 in the U.S. economy. One reason is because there's so much what we call fiscal headwind. Taxes went up and spending went down. Payroll taxes, income taxes, lots of taxes went up. In 2013, the economy had to really push a little harder to grow, and so growth was a little weaker. Inflation in the U.S. economy remains a non-issue. If anything, with inflation, the Federal Reserve is worried that it's too low, with core inflation being substantially less than 2%. This remains a non-issue. I might have to change this bullet point soon. Stock markets and housing markets are heating up. Stock markets are starting to correct already, and that clearly was what I was worried about when I put this point together. Not so much with housing markets yet, but clearly stock markets have got some room to come back down to earth after some gigantic gains in last years. As I already mentioned, the global economy is picking up, and the bottom line is we think the national economy is going to do better this year, 2014, than it did last year. So nice news, a good acceleration. What about Montana? Well, Montana, again, continues to be doing better than the U.S. economy. And to put this into perspective, I put this graph together to show you it's not just Montana, it's really the western portion of the United States, which is by and large leading the U.S. economic recovery. So I put the little dotted line there to show that over the last 1 year period I have data for, wages and salaries grew by 1.6% outside the West. And most states in the West, including Montana at 2.1, did better than that. What's remarkable about this is that, the biggest state, California, is one that's really charging ahead. So these Western states are doing better, broadly speaking, for two reasons. One is that the housing recovery is started earlier here. All right, so housing is coming back quicker in the West than it is in other parts of the country. And also the West is closer to Asia. And Asia is still what's growing the most rapidly in the global economy. What's going on in Montana? Well, we can't show you the same graph year after year, can we? We got to show you a different graph. So I put together a slightly different graph that's going to look at how different Montana industries are faring. And really the bottom line is exactly like the title of this slide suggests. Most Montana industries are expanding. But in order to do this, I'm going to show you growth along in two different ways. It's both growth over the last full year period. That's the horizontal axis. So the further to the right you are, the stronger your growth was over the last full year. And the vertical axis is how you did at the end of the year. How did you close out that year? Did you close out by accelerating, or were you starting to slip towards the end of the year? So if you were in the upper right-hand quadrant, that means you're positive on both scores. Growth at the end plus growth over the whole year, and that's certainly the case for healthcare, one of the largest industries in the state, had another up year, as Bryce will tell us in our healthcare presentation, of the growth story there. On the other side of the ledger is public administration. The government, not counting K-12, has continued to have another year of mild retraction, particularly at the local level. It's a pattern we've seen for a while, and this is clearly because of fiscal pressures still unwinding at the governmental level. Retail trade is starting to come back into growth, not super strong growth, but much better than it's been. Education, I'll put some of these up. Construction had a good year, primarily in eastern Montana, and even then, primarily in heavy construction. A lot of energy-related projects really causing boom times in buildings in east, and not so much in home construction, although things are looking a little better. Professional and technical services is a bit of an outlier. It did close out the year with growth. It shows up as being negative simply because it is because of the sale of Right Now Technologies, 2012 was outsized high. Those employer owners of that company exercised their stock options, showed up as income, so 2013 couldn't match that, and that's why the bar is there. The good side of the economy is coming back. Wholesale trade, transportations, companies, dare I even say it, like MRL, are doing well because the goods part of the economy is coming back strong. Finance and insurance is starting to come back with housing. And we'll be talking about a number of these industries later in the program. How about as we look around the state? Let's do the same thing. Let's put up these little bubbles to say how growth is doing around the state. We start with the community that's not done as well. Cascade County had a bit of a sideways year, a very weak construction year, some uncertainty up there in terms of what's going on with their military footprint. But Western Montana, and this is the story of this graph, Western Montana has swung to growth. Now, some of these communities, just because they're growing doesn't mean they're back to where they were before the recession started, but they're certainly going in the right direction. Flathead County, Paul Polzin called it the epicenter of the recession in Montana, has swung to growth, and that's certainly good news. Gallatin County, again, another year of very strong growth. Lewis and Clark, a little less so. Government remains, as I said, not growing very fast, and that's certainly the archetypical government community in our state. Missoula, I'm happy to say, is up here in the positive side on both sides. Paul will talk about that. Silverbow is a little bit sideways here this time because of the aberrations in copper prices have not helped wage and salary earnings there. Yellowstone, largest county in the state, doing very, very well. And oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of other counties, the rest of the state, all right? If you put the rest of the state together and give it its own bubble, of course, that's a whole bunch of counties. Collectively, it's bigger than any of these counties I've shown. It's also growing very, very fast. This continues to be the big story in Montana, energy production in the east. This is why this is going on, but also very good times in agriculture. Let me show you growth in a slightly different way. Let me talk about what's going on in housing, and particularly housing prices. Because we know in Western Montana in particular, housing has been on a roller coaster. So housing prices, I'm going to take a look at median home sales price at 2 points in time. First one is going to be 2008, which was just before the big crash. And the last data point I have, I wish I could give you 2013, I don't have it yet, so it's 2012. So in between those 2 points of time, 2008 and 2012, things went down, and now they're coming back up. And what this graph is trying to answer is, how far are we? Are we all the way back? All right? And I have a lot of counties in white here because I've excluded counties which have fewer than 100 transactions because they're very noisy and hard to interpret. So let's start with the counties in the red. These are the ones that have the strongest growth in home prices between these 2 points of time. Strong growth? Well, I think so. Richland County home prices, median price of 2012 is 153% higher than it was in 2008. That's what you call a boom. And of course, the other counties in the oil patch are very, very strong. Here in ag country, Fergus County and to some extent Hill County, both of those didn't really see much of a bust. When you get to the west is when it gets more interesting, because now we're talking about balancing the gains of recent years with the declines in the recession. And Missoula came all the way back, we're about at 0. And of course, things have probably grown since then, so I think we're above that now. And you can see the other counties, Gallatin not quite back as of 2012, as is Flathead. So this is mirroring growth to some extent, clearly. Okay, what else is going on? Well, when we got the data to analyze our forecast this year, we got thrown a bit of a curveball. We live and die with the data that come from the federal statistical agencies, and they changed their data on us a little bit and gave us a new profile of Montana's growth through the recession and the recovery. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that if you compute the growth in inflation-corrected non-farm earnings for the state economy, this is the data we had as of about 6 months ago. So in other words, this was the big picture. So declines in 09 and some weak growth in the immediate following years with a little bit of an improvement in 2012. That's where we thought we were. This data is very important to us because that's what we use to construct our forecast, is the trajectory. Then we got some new data. Not too many changes in the first 2 years on this graph, but boy, did they ever change things in 2011 to some things 2012. So now they're saying 2011 is growth over 3%. And just to give you an idea of the trickery of our business, the initial estimate of that was 0.6. All right, so this is a huge revision, ultimately showing the economy growing very fast. We really were kind of worried about what this meant, and we tried to take it apart. So just these last 2 years, 11 and 12, the ones with the big changes, tried to look a little deeper and say, okay, what's inside this earnings? What is this? And earnings is made up of 3 components. The first is wages and salaries, so that's pretty simple. Those are payroll employees that get paychecks. They get a certain amount of money paid to them. We add it up, we compute the growth, and there's really nothing special going on there. 2011 still looks pretty weak, according to wages and salaries, about 70% of the total. Then when you look at benefits, well, benefits is a funny number when you look at it in aggregate because it's very noisy. So you see this big bar in 2011, and that's actually 0 in 2012. Benefits are paid more sometimes when employers have cash on hand and they tuck some money into their pension plans, all right? Or maybe they're told to tuck some money in their pension plans, all right? And so 1 year might be a high benefit year, another year might be a low one. The big story is what's going on with business proprietor income. It's the owners of businesses. They might be construction firms, they might be oil companies, they might be dry cleaners. If your business is making profits, you're not incorporated, it shows up as proprietor income. This is a big number. So we're staying tuned on this. We think this is a little unusual, double-digit growth. We're not sure it corresponds. We don't see how it works in the economy, but it affects our numbers, affects our scorecard. And so let's turn to look exactly at the forecast then, and then we'll have Paul come up here and tell us what's going on in Missoula. The outlook for some key industries. Well, just a few, all right? Energy and mining. Energy and mining together make up about 1/5 of what we call the basic industries in the state of Montana. These are the industries which drive the rest of the economy. And what's going on there? Well, really, it's the same story we were here telling you a year ago and 2 years ago. Energy remains the biggest story in the Montana economy. It's not a new story anymore, but it's still the biggest. The changes that have happened in energy, as Terry Johnson will summarize, is that we're finally seeing cost containment hit the bucket. So the era of the high school educated, $100,000 a year salaried truck driver is probably coming to an end. Maybe, all right? We're seeing more consolidation, fewer companies owning the assets, more mechanization and things done to bring costs down. On the metal side, as I indicated, prices are coming down. That's affecting Montana facilities as evidenced by the closure of the Drumlummen mine, the gold mine in Lewis and Clark County. On agriculture, well, ag is coming off a very, very good financial year. And this has been a big driver. You saw those home price numbers in the near the Golden Triangle in Montana. Those are very strong, and that's part of the reason why. On the government side is interesting. Okay, collectively, federal military and civilian activities in Montana, and of course they're very important in Missoula as well, collectively those make up almost 1/3 of what drives the Montana economy. And we've reported in the past that that trajectory has to come down. all right? But that's in the medium term. In the short term, with the recent House passage of the Farm Bill and with the passing of the budget, it's become very clear to us as forecasters that the pressure for deficit discipline in DC is going down, all right? We don't expect to see as much improvement in the federal budget deficit as we've seen the last couple of years, and it's just not a vote getter to be saying no all the time to spending. And so I think that noose, that tourniquet, if you will, on spending is starting to loosen a little bit, and that factors into our forecast. Well, let me end with a forecast. What is going on in the Montana economy? This is our scorecard, growth in non-farm earnings, inflation corrected. This was the growth profile we saw when we were here last year, delivering this forecast. So 2011, a bad year. 2012 was better, and we thought 2013 would come in right about the same. As I said before, a huge data revision that took place to those first 2 years. Our 2013 forecast so far is looking pretty good. We forecast 2.7, looks like it might be just slightly better than that. That looks like a slowdown. I'm not sure. I'm not sure those first two bars are right. Okay, so it was a pretty good year in 2013. I think the economy stuck to the script, and we're slightly more optimistic about 2014 because of the U.S. economy and because of what's going on in key industries. And we see no reason to temper that optimism in the out years. I think we're the one good thing about a long recession and a slow recovery is there is a lot of pent-up demand, and there's a lot of repair work has been accomplished in our banking sector and consumers. So with that, I will stop, and I'd be happy to take a question or two. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you, Pat. What we would like to do here is we have 4 microphones around the room, and we appreciate it if you would ask your question into the microphone. We want to take a couple of questions here with Pat, then we're going to talk about the Missoula and the Ravalli County area economies, and we'll bring Pat back. So is there a question for Pat? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Pat, we've been witness to quantitative easing, what, 2 or 3 times now? And in a normal situation, you would see inflation going through the roof. Could you explain why we're not seeing inflation with all these billions and billions of dollars flooding?
Sure. Everybody heard the question. I mean, why aren't we seeing inflation when we have quantitative easing, which, of course, quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve buys things like bonds and securities with printed money, all right? My first remark is to chuckle because there's nothing normal. In normal times with quantitative easing, there's nothing normal about quantitative easing. It's very unusual. So we don't have a good benchmark of what to expect. But I think the reason why we haven't had any inflation, is really, there's 2 reasons, but the most important one is that labor force participation. There is so much slack in the U.S. economy. The economy could grow so much faster now without taxing our existing resources very much, that there's really not much pressure on inflation because we have such weak demand, we have a lot of spare capacity. The other reason, which is slightly a smaller reason, is that all the other economies in the world are in the same boat. So that's the reason.
Another question for Pat. Yes, sir.
So, there's a lot of talk now about increasing the minimum wage. So in a consumer-based economy, 66% of economic growth roughly is consumption. What effect will that have, and what effect could that have on our state if the minimum wage at the federal level was to go up to $10 an hour?
Yeah, that's the easier of the 2 questions. I thought you were going to ask, should we have an increase in the minimum wage? And that's a rather divisive question. Practically none. Okay, I don't think that would have much of an impact on the aggregate economy. The issue with the minimum wage is how it affects individual employers. We have people in our office that make less than $10 an hour. It would affect us, just as it would everyone else. But in terms of the impact on the economy, it is not important enough, it's not central enough to what's causing the economy to grow more slowly to really matter much.
Thank you, Pat. A quick announcement, there is a white Buick LeSabre with the lights on. If that might be yours, AZG458, you might want to check on it. We'd hate to see you, we'd hate to have to call AAA for you after the program. We want now to turn to a look at Missoula and Ravalli County, and in doing that, we'll look at some regional comparisons, and then as part of those regional comparisons, look at some of the dramatic trends in the Bakken area that Pat referred to earlier. So to do that, would you please welcome the former Director Emeritus of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Paul Polzin.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm glad it wasn't my Mercedes 600 that had left its lights on. For the past several years, my job has been to look at the individual city economies across the state. But also in the last several years, we've noticed that much of the new economic growth in the state is occurring outside of the major cities. So I'm taking a little different approach now. I'm going to look at regions and cities together. So what are the regions in Montana? Here they are. Now, whenever you put a map or whenever you divide the state into regions, you start having a lot of arguments. Shouldn't Helena be in the West region? Butte Anaconda always wants to be its own region. But basically, our regions are the Great Falls trade area, the Billings trade area, and the Missoula trade area. Now let's start by looking at the most recent period. The growth in these economies since between 2009 and 2013. And basically 2009 is the trough of the last recession. 2013 is our most recent data. And we see right away a pattern that is going to be repeated in the other data. The slowest growing part of the state is in the west. Notice that all of the communities in the west have been growing less than the statewide average. Kalispell, Flathead County has probably done the best. And you see that both Ravalli and Missoula County are down there with less than 1% growth per year over the recent years. Look at the rural areas in western Montana. Very slow growth. And keep that in mind when we look at the other regions. Here we have the fast-growing region. This is the rural southeast. This is the Billings trade area. Notice immediately where the fast growth is, in the rural counties of the southeast. That includes the Bakken, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But again, Yellowstone was very rapidly growing, and Gallatin, that's Bozeman, came in at just about the statewide average. The final region is the northeast. That's the Great Falls trade area. See the pattern again. The faster growth in the northeast. And Lewis and Clark and Cascade counties came in at relatively slow growth. So in the two easternmost regions, you see that the rapid growth is primarily in the rural areas. Now let's look at Missoula and let's look at the trajectory of growth here in the Missoula economy. And I put in those lines that represent the peak, or the beginning of the last recession and the trough of the national recession. And we can see the story here in Missoula has been one of slow growth. And this slow growth was going on before the recession. It was just not a recession phenomenon. We were growing slowly before the recession. We had a long, but not too bad recession. And again, you can see that growth, but very slow growth afterwards. If we put up employment, we see a local reflection of a national trend. Nationwide, we know that this has been a jobless recovery, and we see that here in the data from Missoula County. Employment in 2013 is barely where it was in 2008. Let's look at Ravalli County. Much more severe, much more significant recession impact. That rapid growth right before the recession in Ravalli County was primarily construction and also log homes. And we can see the same kind of trend in employment. Not much growth in employment. Employment now is actually less than it was before the recession began. Now let's look at the basic industries here in Missoula County. We can start with construction. Now, construction is not a basic industry, but construction has been a very important component of the last business cycle. Probably the best news for construction in Missoula County is the outlook for commercial construction. Things like Cabela's, things like Missoula College, things like the old Sawmill District look as though they are going to be beginning and continuing during 2014. Right now, state government and University of Montana is the largest component of the economic base in Missoula. Outside of a one-time jump because of the end of the state government pay freeze, we look for only slow growth or even no growth in terms of state government. Missoula is a medical center serving a wide area, but really forecasting health care is very, very difficult until we get a better feel of the Affordable Care Act. Federal government, again, stability at best, not a growth industry in the short term. Trade center for services. These are the service firms that serve the rural areas. Remember, we saw very slow growth in the rural areas. That's probably going to continue. Transportation, that's energy related. Just looking at all those trains, you know they have either coal or oil on them. That's energy. And that's the local impact of the energy boom in eastern Montana. Non-resident travel, moderate growth. Wood and paper, we're finally starting to see an upturn in wood and paper as the national home building cycle resumes. Trade center wholesale, again, slow rural growth. Looking at Ravalli County, the big thing with Ravalli County is, remember, it's a commuter county. The largest single share of the economic base in Ravalli County are people who work in Missoula but live in Ravalli. Again, we're looking for a modest uptick in construction in Ravalli County. The best news for those commuters in Ravalli County is that Missoula is recovering. Medical research, that includes both Glaxo and Rocky Mountain Lab, those are showing positive trends. Federal government stable. Metal manufacturing, that's the armaments industry. Wood products, again, the recovery is beginning. Now, how do these play out in terms of our forecast for these two areas? Here we have Missoula County, and notice that was at the tail end of the recession. We still had declines in 2010, but modest and accelerating growth in 2011, 12, and 13. We're forecasting continued growth, but we'll see that this is relatively slow on the statewide level, somewhere between 2.3 to 2.7%. Looking at Ravalli County, again, the recession was particularly long and hard in Ravalli County. They still had a decline in 2010 and 2011, a little bit of an increase in 12 and 13, and we're looking for roughly 2 to 2.5% growth in the out years looking at Ravalli County. Region-wide, from 2014 to 2017, the state of Montana should grow at about 3% per year. We're looking for a slight acceleration in the rural areas of the West, about a 1.8%, and we're looking at 2.0 average of 2% growth in Ravalli County, 2.4% growth in Missoula County, good by historic standards, but still well less than the statewide average. The southeast region, the Billings area, should continue to be the fast growing. Notice that very rapid growth in the rural southeast. That's the Bakken, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. The Great Falls trade area, we're looking for relatively rapid growth in the rural areas, and our forecast for this area might be too low because as the Bakken, as the drilling starts expanding northwest from Sydney, that gets into Roosevelt County. That's in the rural southeast. And we're looking at 2.1% growth in both Lewis and Clark County and Cascade County. Now, the past several years, I've followed a very rigid format in looking at the cities. And some of you that have been here each year can probably do it just as well as I have. We compare the growth between cities, we compare the growth between the counties, compared to the statewide average, and then we look at the basic industries. What if we take that same approach, and instead of looking at our cities in Montana, we look at the Bakken area? Most of the stories that you hear about the Bakken have to do with drilling, how much oil is down there, has to do with other issues. We're going to be looking at the Bakken now in terms of regional analysis. How do the cities and counties in the Bakken compare when we look at them regionally? First, we have to reorientate our geography a little bit. We're going to be looking at 4 counties, 2 in Montana, 2 in North Dakota. We're going to be looking at Richland County, that's Sidney in Montana, that's the northernmost of those counties, and Fallon County, a little further south. In North Dakota, we're going to be looking at Williams County, that's Williston, and Montreal County, that's the rural county just east of Williston. Long-term trends. What has happened in these counties relative to the statewide average in North Dakota and Montana? From 2001 to 2012, Montana grew at an average compound rate of 2.3% per year. You can see that both Richland and Fallon counties were well above the statewide average. In North Dakota, the state grew at about 4.6%. Notice the rapid growth in Williams County, that's Williston, and also Montreal County. But the last decade really consists of 2 components, before the recession and after the recession. Let's look at these counties now in those 2 segments. First, 2001 to 2007. Notice that the 2 Montana counties were growing at about 8% per year, again, well above the statewide average. In North Dakota, Williams County was well above the statewide average, but at least before the recession, nothing was particularly happening in Montreal County. Now let's look at the most recent period. Yeah, you see the difference right away. Here in Montana, the 2 Montana counties continued to grow at about 8 to 10% per year, or 8 to 12% per year, well above the statewide average. But here's where you're getting into some of those fantastic growth bars, the fantastic annual growth in Williams and Montreal County. 32% a year, 38% per year. Now, again, let's look at the profile of this economic growth over time. Here's non-farm earnings in Richland County. You can see the definite impact of the recession, and you can see the definite acceleration in Richland County after the recession ended. Here's Williams County. Both Richland and Williams County were roughly neck to neck before the recession began, but Williams County really took off in the last several years. But it's interesting to see that even in Williams County, the recession did have an impact. Let's look at our 2 rural counties. Here's Fallon County. You can see almost no recession impact, and you can see a slight acceleration in the last several years. That's Montreal County. Much, much more rapid growth in the last several years. And notice that in these 2 rural counties, the recession impact was minimal. The basic industries in each one of these counties. Let's start by looking at Richland County. Here we have the basic labor or basic non-farm earnings in 2001 and 2012. A significant growth in the economic base. And much of that growth was in the 2 bottom bars. The blue one is oil and gas, and the red one is transportation. And this transportation component is one of the unique characteristics of the Bakken area oil development. Because of the lack of pipeline transmission, much of this oil has to be transported by trucks. You can see that the energy development is now a much more important part of the Richland County economy. It now accounts for 60% of the economic base in Richland County. But notice that oil is not the only game in town in Richland County. There was significant expansion of agriculture, and that's primarily irrigated sugar beets. Here's Williams County. And in Williams County, you see, and in all the other counties, that the oil and gas industry plus trucking is a much larger share of the economic base. It is 87% of the economic base in Williams County. And 90% of the economic base in Mountrail County. In other words, with the exception of Richland County, oil and gas and transportation are now the dominant industries in the economic base in all of these counties. Resource development, one of the supposed advantages of resource development is that it creates higher paying jobs. Here we have average annual wages and salaries in Richland County and Williams County. Notice that they started off at about the same level, $30,000 a year in 2003 in Richland County, $32,000 a year in Williams County. They were about 91% of the statewide average in Montana and about 97% of the statewide average in Williams County. But look what happened by the time we got to 2012. Average annual wages and salaries were 133% of the statewide average in Richland County and 171% of the statewide average in Williams County. Now this is an average of all jobs in these two counties. And one's first reaction is, yeah, those petroleum engineers and those roughnecks are high wage jobs. But what if we look at an industry that has a reputation for being a low paying industry, the food service industry? Again, we see that beginning in 2003, Montana figures in Richland County. Richland County was about 81% of the statewide average. Williams County was about 97% of the North Dakota average. But look what happened by 2012. There's 109%, food service average wages were about 109% of the statewide average in Richland County and 146% of the statewide average in North Dakota. So with that, I'd like to end. I'd like to invite Pat back up, and maybe you have some questions for either.
Questions for Paul or Pat? Again, we have microphones around the room. We have some questions.
Certainly there's a question or a comment. International, national, Montana economy, Missoula economy. Yes, sir.
Paul, can you draw any conclusions, or do you have any comparable cities that Missoula might be able to compare itself to or look to in terms of its progression over the next number of years?
Are there comparable cities to Missoula? I think you'd have to look for cities where the wood products industry used to be a dominant factor and is now not so because of a much more limited timber supply. The big reason why Missoula has been growing slowly is that we've had a major hit in one of our basic industries. That's the wood products industry. We had permanent closures of the mill out in Bonner. We had a permanent closure of the pulp and paper mill. These facilities are not coming back as this recession ends.
Yeah, can you elaborate on the declines in the Bakken? I mean, I think Pat alluded to that there's projected to be decline in wages, and what's impacting that?
The decline in the Bakken, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but there are a couple ways of interpreting that. One is that the rate of growth is leveling out. That seems to be the case. They are getting much more efficient in terms of drilling. They can now drill 2 or 3 wells from the same site. And so that's why we're seeing a slight deceleration in terms of employment.
Terry will deal with it too.
Yeah.
So we have a speaker later, if you bring that point up then, and he'll be glad to address it. Other questions, comments? If not, thank you, Paul and Pat.
We want to begin now our look at major industries in Montana with a look at the healthcare industry. And to do that, we're putting him on the spot. We're very pleased to introduce our brand new, in fact, technically he doesn't start until Monday, I don't think, our brand new Director of Healthcare Research. Would you please welcome Bryce Ward?
Thanks, Chuck. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm finding a certain poetry that my first act as healthcare director is taking place in this room. 5.5 years ago, this is where my wedding reception was. I was right about there. You know, there's a certain symmetry as well in that there were about as many people in the room, and I knew about as many of them. My wife is much more popular than I am. But while I have a strong urge to get out there and start dancing, instead I think I want to do something more fun. Let's talk about healthcare. So the last time I was here was 2008. And just a few weeks prior, I'd been teaching at Lewis and Clark College, you know, the presidential candidates' healthcare plans. And since that period, in early 2008, I feel like the healthcare policy discussion has gone pretty much like this. Obamacare, 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 Obamacare. So what am I going to talk about today? Obamacare. Just kidding. Well, not really. You know, mostly we're going to talk about a few healthcare trends that have been lurking under the radar. But as a health policy wonk in 2014, it is my contractual obligation to update you on the status of the Affordable Care Act. So we'll do that, and then we'll talk about some other stuff. So a year ago, I'm told, Pat put up this slide, and it was talking about the stuff that was 1 year away. You know, we've done a few things early on, the small business tax credit, the coverage of kids living in their parents' basements. You know, then we had the flexible savings plans and medical device taxes and stuff. And then, you know, now it's 2014, and all this stuff was supposed to happen. And for the most part, it's happening. The exchanges are at least semi-operational. Not every state adopted the Medicaid expansion, so you know that didn't happen as widespread as originally planned. But the individual mandate is in effect. The employer mandate, well, now that's going over here into 2015, and that's pretty much where we're at. You know, you'll be hearing more about it as it becomes more entrenched. But for those of us who followed the Massachusetts experience, you know, what's happening looks a lot like what's happening there, so we're kind of where we thought we would be. In Montana, though, there's been some interesting new developments outside of the Affordable Care Act. Big news, you know, Montana Blue Cross Blue Shield, which pretty much provided health insurance for much of the state, was acquired out of state. That's a continuing a long-standing and widespread trend of, you know, more consolidation in all parts of the healthcare industry, on the provider side and on the insurer side. Everybody's getting bigger. That has some consequences, but we won't talk about them. The spin-off of that is that the Montana Healthcare Foundation was established. It's really exciting. You have a foundation with a decent chunk of change that is dedicated to improving the healthcare of people in the state. So we'll see how that plays out. That's all new. Here in Missoula, we have the Western Montana Residency Program. That's good news for our healthcare because it means that we'll be able to attract and retrain doctors. And one of the interesting things about healthcare is where you get trained matters for two reasons. One, you're more likely to stay where you got trained. You know, I moved here from Portland yesterday, and you know, obviously Portland has a medical school. It also has a dental school, which I'm going to talk about because I have a friend who was in dental school. And everybody who went to the dental school, when they were done, wanted to stay in Portland. The problem, of course, is that there's a dental school in Portland, and all the other dentists who graduated before them stayed in Portland. So there's really no jobs for dentists in Portland, so they all have to leave. But that's the first thing that happens when you have people trained is they want to stay, particularly in a place that offers a good quality of life. The second thing is where they get trained matters for how they practice. And one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit later is healthcare costs. And one of the things that we now know from a recent study is that how you got trained changes how you practice medicine, and it changes how then expensive your medical care is. So hopefully we can, Montana actually tends to be pretty cheap, so hopefully we're training our doctors to be efficient, and that will be a good thing for Montana long term. And the last thing that's been happening in Montana is numerous hospital affiliations connecting Montana to out-of-state organizations. Again, there's the linkages, kind of like what's going on the insurance side, the provider side. There's more linkages between the hospitals in-state and out-of-state, as well as more rural and urban linkages, which should help create better continuity of care for all parts of the state. The two big things I want to talk about today that have been kind of lurking under the radar. When I was teaching that class back in 2008 at Lewis and Clark, I said, look, when you're a health policy economist or health economist, we answer three big questions, right? One thing that we're always concerned about is why is healthcare so expensive in the United States? The second question we ask is why do so many people in the United States not have access to care? And the third thing is why aren't we so much healthier than every place else if we're spending so much more, right? Those are the three big questions that we tend to dwell on as health policy economists. And the Affordable Care Act, it touches on all three of those things. But it's mostly trying to solve the access problem, right? Get people insurance, get them to the doctor, right? So what else is going on in those other parts of the world, particularly with cost? There's been a slowdown in healthcare spending. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. It was growing, when I was born, it was interesting. As we were packing up to move out here, I was rummaging through this box of keepsakes that my mom, when I finally bought a house, was so happy to dump into my house. So I'm rummaging through this thing in the garage, and one of the things I found in there was my mom's hospital bill from when I was born. Even adjusted for inflation, I believe it was like $1,200. I have two small children, one of whom is 1. The most recent child, our health care bill was $12,500. Both cases, simple vaginal delivery. So we're really excited to say, so when I was born, healthcare consumed about 8% of GDP. It now consumes 18% of GDP, and the projections are that it's going to continue to consume more and more and more of our economic pie, right? So in the early 2000s, it was growing really fast. It was expected to get much higher than it's gotten because it slowed down. It's a national phenomenon, and it predates Obamacare, so we're going to investigate that a little bit more. The second thing we're going to talk about is a bunch of information that the Bureau collected recently on the uninsured in Montana. The census tells us how many people don't have insurance, but what the Bureau did was a survey which tells us a whole lot more about why people don't have insurance. And it's really important to understand this if we're going to try and actually solve the problem of getting people access. All right, so what's happened to healthcare spending? So what does this tell us, right? So our horizontal axis is just time. The vertical axis, that's telling us the annual percentage change in healthcare spending. So if you look at 2001, for instance, in 2001, healthcare spending rose by 9.7% year over year. And then since then, we've been slowly moving down the peak. And in the past 4 years, it's basically been hovering right around 3.9%. Now that's still growing faster than the economy. So the healthcare as a share of the economy is still growing. But it's now, we've moderated the pace a little bit. And that's a good thing. So for much of the past 2 years, we've had one policy discussion in this country, and it had to do with debt. But the dirty little secret about the projections of exploding federal government debt is that it has a single parent, healthcare costs. Medicare and Medicaid basically are what drives the projected increase in our federal budget deficits and our federal debt. So when you see this kind of stuff happening, that means great. Those debt projections, they still grow, but they grow at a lower rate if we assume that this will continue. So if we're going to assume that it's going to continue, we need to understand what's driving it. And we need to ask the question of, is this going to last long term? So what we have here we're going to break down the different parts of healthcare into its major components: hospitals, physicians, prescription drugs, administration costs, and other. And we've indexed it all to 2007. That's why all the lines intersect at 2007. And so hospitals, they really haven't seen a moderation in spending. So the healthcare spending moderation is not because of declines in spending in hospitals. However, everything else is below kind of the trend that it was on before. So physicians, and, we see particularly large declines in prescription drugs. And so the question we want to ask is, well, what can explain this stuff, right? Some people are crowing that it's the Affordable Care Act. The problem, of course, is one of timing. It starts before the Affordable Care Act was, even passed, much less implemented. So it's hard to attribute too much of it to the Affordable Care Act. Medicare payments have gone up a little bit less, but it doesn't seem to be too much related to that. We have some demographic trends. We have the recession. We have a public focus on cost containment, and we have changes in delivery technology and growth in high deductible plans. Now, ultimately, we don't really know what's driving it. The most recent stuff that I've been reading kind of points to combinations of these. So how does that work? Well, let's take two of them together, right? Let's take growth in high deductible plans. Now, high deductible plans, as many of you probably have experienced, because in the past 7 years, the average deductible for an employee-sponsored plan has more than doubled, or almost doubled. So you now, or probably many of you are at least aware, that when you go to the doctor, you're gonna have to pay a lot more out of pocket. And when, simple economics says, look, if you make people pay out of pocket, they're gonna consume less, right? And, kind of going back to the last slide, you don't stop going to the hospital, because when you go to the hospital, typically you are going to the hospital because you need to go to the hospital. But what do you do? You don't go to the doctor when you got a cold. You switch from brand name prescription drugs to generic drugs. So some of that kind of stuff, it might work, right? But for a long time, we've known about how people respond to healthcare costs when they're asked to bear the burden. And it doesn't explain as much. But if you combine the recession with it, you might be able to get enough juice to explain what's going on. Recession means that people are more sensitive than they might otherwise be. You make them pay a little bit more out of cost, they consume a little less. These are the types of explanations that might work. We don't really know. We're still trying to figure it out. So now moving on to the second point. What's going on with the uninsured in Montana? Who are they? Why don't they have insurance? And this is important because you'll recall when the exchanges were rolling out and it was a disaster, people were concerned that the right mix of people weren't going to sign up. What does that mean? Well, insurance, we're basically just pooling risks. So we need everybody to sign up. We need the healthy people to be involved. We need because they pay more than they consume, and that helps subsidize the cost of the sick. So if we ended up with just a bunch of sick people enrolling in insurance, then the premium estimates will be wrong and the cost will go up, and the whole thing won't work. So let's look at Montana. Let's try and understand who's insured and not. So this tells us where people are getting their insurance in the U.S. A little over 50% get their insurance from their employer, and then there's large chunks of Medicaid. We've cut off the Medicare population here because it's pretty easy to understand what's going on with them. And then we have, almost 20% of people uninsured nationally. Montana, slightly less employer coverage, slightly more uninsured, slightly less Medicaid. So one key question that came out of the Bureau of Studies, in fact, to me, one of the most interesting questions is, we ask, well, how is your health status, right? So one of the concerns that I mentioned is that people who don't have insurance do so because they're healthy. I'm young and healthy. I don't need to go to the doctor. Why should I get insurance? I've been to the doctor twice in the past decade, right? I'm very fortunate. So why have I been buying insurance? Well, I haven't, just kind of came along with the job. So I technically been buying it, but I didn't have a choice to. I'm down there in that excellent health category, but it turns out that our best estimates, so that's the middle bar, the extremes of the bar. This is a survey, so we have to, throw in a confidence interval for the uncertainty that surrounds our estimate. But it turns out that amongst the people 18 to 64 who are uninsured, almost 50% of them describe their health as fair or poor. Right? So it's the unhealthy people who are most likely to not have health insurance. And this was part of the reason why access was such an issue and why the Affordable Care Act had political momentum, is lots of people in that category would like to get insurance, but they couldn't because they literally couldn't access it. And so just to kind of reiterate that point, you ask the people who are uninsured if it's voluntary or involuntary, and only 16%, so less than 1 in 5 of the uninsured in Montana said, yes, I'm uninsured because I don't want to buy insurance. The vast majority, 76%, they would like to get insurance, but they couldn't. Well, why couldn't they get insurance? It's too expensive, right? Their job didn't pay enough. The premiums were too high. They didn't have a job. There's our young and healthy group, right? It was less than 50 respondents that were like, hey, I'm young and healthy. I don't need insurance. So it kind of all comes back. Everything comes back to that cost question. The reason that people don't have insurance is not because, there's a few people, it's because they don't want it, but for the most part, it's because it's too expensive for what they can afford. So, while the Affordable Care Act does help solve the access problem, these people now, in some form, may have access to some insurance that they didn't have access to before. But the big problem that we're going to have to grapple with over the long run is still that cost containment. And while we've seen it moderate some to date, nothing that we've seen suggests that this is going to last forever. Over the long run, we expect costs to grow. And so then it kind of comes back to, well, who's going to provide the insurance? And this is where we start asking about, the Bureau also surveyed employers about who offers health insurance, right? And as you expect, pretty much all big employers, more than 50 employees, 94% of the large employers in the state of Montana offer health insurance. Even if you're in the 26 to 50 employees, it's over 80%. And more than half of 6 to 25 offer insurance. However, small firms, of which if you're just counting firms, not employment, that's a lot of firms. They don't. You're looking at, what is that, about 25% of the 1 to 5 employee firms offered insurance in 2011. And again, why didn't they do it? Well, the premiums were too high. All right. Well, now the law has changed, and certainly, there's some more pressure for employers to provide insurance, so that will change some. But at the end of the day, the basic economics of it haven't changed. We have to, cost containment is going to be the story of my life in terms of healthcare policy. Is how do we make healthcare more efficient, right? Healthcare is good. We all want healthcare. And the fact that it's growing as a share of GDP isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as we're getting good value. And so that's where the fights are going to come in the future are, well, how do we make healthcare more efficient? How do we get more for our more bang for our buck so we have more money to do all the other things that we like to do? What are some takeaways? Projecting healthcare costs isn't as easy as it used to be. For a long time, it was really fast, and now it's slowed down. This isn't the first time this happened. We had a slowdown in healthcare cost growth in the 90s, and everybody was like, the world has changed. Managed care organizations have solved our healthcare cost growth problem, and then, of course, that stopped. We're likely to see that happen here again in the next few years. So that's why we're going to have to keep dealing with it. It's certainly dangerous to assume that the cost slowdown will continue. And health insurance is a big burden, right? It costs a lot. And we want to get more bang for our buck going forward. Now that it's the law of the land that you have it, I think we're going to want to make sure that we get more for it. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Questions for Bryce? Comments? Healthcare, big topic area. Yes, Bryce.
We have quite a movement in the country to pay more attention to our health at earlier ages, and so people are running and exercising and so on. Is that industry a growth industry in a significant way that might offset some of the change in the traditional healthcare industry that we're seeing?
Yes, I think so. At least I was optimistic so. So again, I'm coming from Oregon. My undergraduate degree is at the University of Oregon, birthplace of Nike. you know, in Portland, you have Nike, Adidas, you have all the athletic apparel companies. And one of the initiatives that I worked on when I was there was, you know, the governor has laid down a challenge to make Oregon the healthiest state in the country, right? That means that, and Oregon already is, you know, a recent survey came out from the Centers of Disease Control, you know, and Oregon was second only to Colorado in the share of its people who met the 2008 guidelines for physical activity. But there's a big industry in terms of fitness and wellness. And getting people fit and well, you know, look, we're all going to end up, it doesn't solve our healthcare cost problem, but it does make healthcare better because we're all going to die, right? We don't have the magic bullet on that one yet. So because you're going to die, that means that we're going to spend money on your healthcare, right? But what we know about people who are healthy is that they get to have a whole lot longer life where they're healthy, right? You know, people who work out and you know, that kind of stuff, you know, they're into their 70s before they start deteriorating, and basically they have this really short, compact period of you know, going off a cliff, and as opposed to this 20-year, I've got 3 chronic diseases and I'm really costly to manage me. So that's what we're trying to get to. Prevention isn't a cure for our healthcare costs because, like I said, you're going to end up sick at some point. But it does solve another part of what that third issue that I talked about, which is quality, right? You know, the purpose of healthcare is so that you're healthy. And, you know, there is a growth industry, particularly in places like Western Montana, which offer a quality of life and, you know, kind of spur people outside to, you know, try and harness that and figure out ways to do it here that you can export to other people.
Bryce, we have one here.
I see the Affordable Care Act is still not too affordable. You know, the premiums are still very high. And why is it that when they did the Affordable Care Act, the risk wasn't spread to the entire United States? It's just still within the populations within the insurance companies.
Well, so let me break that down. So healthcare isn't affordable because it's not affordable. You know, in the U.S. we have 2 problems. Why is healthcare expensive? First is that our prices are high, and second is that we utilize things, not everything, but some things at a higher rate. And the Affordable Care Act didn't address those, right? You know, there's programs in experiments, and there's things that are going to happen where we're testing things out to see if we can make healthcare more affordable. But the fundamental thrust of the Affordable Care Act was access. Get people who don't have insurance. So, you know, we didn't magically solve the fact that we utilize the healthcare that we use and the prices that it exists at currently through the Affordable Care Act. Why the insurance pools were designed the way they are, that's something that I probably knew at some point, but I don't recall as I sit here. You know, part of it has to do with not wanting to fight over the existing state regulatory apparatus. Part of it has to do with you know, just the way the markets were set up. You know, again, this was designed to be, you know, as controversial as it has been, it's designed to be the most benign way of changing this that you could kind of think about. You know, as a Montanan, you don't want to move into a big national pool. You don't want Mississippi in your pool any more than you need. You already have to do that with Medicare. You know, where, you know, there's places in, you know, say, McAllen, Texas, or Miami, Florida, you know, Medicare spending per enrollee is 3 times what it is in this state, right? And everybody pays for it. You guys pay for it, right? We all pay our Medicare taxes, right? It's not, you know, your Medicare taxes aren't, you know, adjusted. So it would be nice if they were, but, you know, be blunt, to answer your second question, I couldn't get back into the details of why it was exactly that way.
We have time for one more question back here.
Good morning. Thank you for your observations, and I appreciate the information. Well done. My question is, the last legislature in Montana failed to perform in the sense that Medicaid expansion was shelved. In lieu of that, there's still some pursuits going on in other states, specifically the Arkansas plan, which is an alternative, and wondered if you could comment on that. Thank you.
You know, I'm fresh off the boat or out of the car, so I know that the Medicaid expansion in Montana was very controversial, and there's some sort of one vote issue that I recall hearing about from 500 miles away. You know, it's certainly controversial. I won't say that, you know, one should or shouldn't do it. I don't think that's my place yet. There certainly are trade-offs associated with the fact that you chose not to do it, in terms of what happens to your low-income population, in terms of, you know, what we were talking about in terms of its ability to actually access insurance. And, you know, those are normative discussions, you know, which I won't try and wade into, having been here for, what time is it now? It's 9:30, so I've been here for 21 hours. So I think I'm not going to touch that one yet. Okay.
We appreciate Bryce jumping right into the fray today. Obviously, he'll be around not only today, but for quite a few years in the future. So get a hold of him if you want to follow up on some of those questions.